All right. So
You're
I think Hannah probably can hear me, but she can't respond other than by typing in. So if you need to give me a message, type me in, and I've got my friendly cell phone right here, so I will check in for Hannah's message. All right. So hello, everyone. How is everyone today?
Yes, thank you. Well,
okay, so today I think this is going to be an interesting lesson because when Balkan first came to me and said, would you like to do a lecture for this online Black Sea University and do something in my own area of specialization, I generally study the South Caucasus. I thought it would be interesting to do something on gender. So I'm going to introduce myself first, and then hopefully tell you about a topic that you probably haven't really thought much about when you think of the Black Sea region, especially the post-communist space. My name is Itir Bagdadi, and I am a lecturer in the Political Science and International Relations Department here at the Izmir University of Economics. I'm also director of the Gender Studies Research and Application Center, so we do a lot of things on gender on campus here, a lot of things to get people to sort of get to know what gender is and get to know women's rights. And I do academic studies in that area as well. And one of the things that I wanted to talk to you about today is when we think about the Black Sea region, one of the things that we, I think, neglect when we look at hardcore security issues are the gender dynamics of the region itself. So hopefully, and I see a lot of women in the, well, I don't see a lot of people in the audience, but I do see 4 women in the audience, so hopefully this will be a lecture that will give you some insight as well. And then how many people, where are you guys, by the way? I'm seeing, let's see, I see one that has men in it, so one of my audiences has men in it. Where are you guys? Are you guys in Russia? Okay. You can't talk back, right? Can I hear you guys or no? Because this is the first time I'm doing this. Okay, I guess it's not much of an interaction. Okay. So like I said, I am the director of the Gender Studies Research and Application Center here, and we try to do research on gender. And one of the things about the post-Soviet and the post-communist space that most people don't really think a lot about is what happened to gender relations and dynamics once this transition happened. And the book that I actually am using is sort of the fundamental textbook or the Bible of anyone who's going to do gender analysis in this region, is a book by 2 political scientists by the name of Susan Gall and Gail Kligman called The Politics of Gender After Socialism. And this is a must-read book for those of you that are interested. It is a book of political science. It was released from Princeton University Press in the year 2000. And yes, there are some updates that have been made to it. And then myself, along with other feminists that also study this area, try to analyze, in line with these theories, how gender has actually changed. Now, so what I'm going to do today is give you a little bit of a background, which will probably take a few minutes, and then I'll talk to you about my own case study, which is the political economy of sex trafficking. So it will definitely have something to do with political science, international relations, and political economy. Let's talk about socialism and what the socialism project was. Now, what followed the collapse of socialism, or what was the socialist system itself? Once the socialist project collapsed, we started to see certain things that emerged from this. Class differentiations, which did not exist before, or ethnic differentiations, which didn't exist before, a rise in unemployment, a decline in state subsidies. Now, all of these costs were real costs, but they actually were experienced differently by men and by women. So when we look at, for instance, who was unemployed more, the women were unemployed more than the men in this transition. Or if we look at the decline in state subsidies, you see, the socialist state was a developmental project in which people were made dependent on the state for many things, for provisions, for jobs, for health care, for many things. And women became more dependent than any other group. So when the state subsidies fell apart because socialism had fallen apart, the one group that suffered the most, comparatively speaking, were the women. And all of these costs were experienced differently by men and women. Now, here we have to sidetrack a little bit and maybe go back into one of the things that we tend to look at in feminist political science is that the personal is political. So feminists will argue what happens in the household is political. domestic violence is political. It's not domestic. It's something that happens from one human being to another. So therefore, all of these issues need to be considered basically within the political realm as well. So in essence, if the personal is political, what happened to the women during the transitions becomes a political issue as well. The fact that they now had these domestic things that they needed to do, but on top of that, state subsidies were cut, so they no longer had the jobs that they had before or the economic conditions to do certain things. So the question to ponder that Gal and Kligman actually ask us is, what role do the discourses and practices of gender play in shaping the post-1989 restructuring of states and social relations that followed in the region? So what we're trying to understand is how these things affected gender dynamics in the region. And as a feminist political economist, this to me is a fundamental question. It's not one of those side questions that you look at once you handle hardcore security issues. Now, once we look at post-socialism, what we realize in a lot of the books and works that have actually existed is the fact that a lot of these works focused on things like economic processes of marketization and privatization, the shock therapies that happened as these countries were trying to sort of make their transitions, the political processes of democratization and I can't seem to pronounce this word, of making a new constitution, the emergence of civil society, the role of outside forces. So what role did the USA, the EU, Russia play in sort of the democratization process there? More with the countries of the region that had energy. We're starting to see, we saw a lot of works in energy policy and energy politics. Currently, a lot of the research is being focused on regime durability, authoritarianism, what's going on with the authoritarian regimes in the region. But we really didn't get to see a lot of works on gender. And so the questions that the book on gender that Gal and Kligman wrote back in the early 2000s was, how are gender relations and ideas about gender shaping political and economic change in the region? And what forms of gender inequality are also being shaped as a result? Now, first, let's begin by defining the term gender. When we talk about gender, we talk about socially and culturally produced ideas about male and female difference, power, and inequality that structure the reproduction of these differences in the institutionalized practices of society. So gender, different from sex, sex is what you're born with. You're either a boy or a girl at birth, right? But when you talk about gender, there you load certain social and cultural things, ideas, into the terms, so that men are expected to act and behave a certain way, and women are expected to act and behave in a certain way. Now, not only do state policies constrain gender relations, but ideas about the differences between men and women shape the ways in which states are imagined, they're constituted, and they are legitimated. Now, when we look at the socialist gender order, the socialist gender order worked a little differently than the capitalist gender order. With socialism, there was an attempt to erase gender differences, along with class and ethnic differences. There was a creation of persons directly dependent on a paternalist state. Women's full-time participation in the labor force, or state socialism, claimed to emancipate women. So within the socialist project, women were given a place in the workforce equal to that of men. But then the dependency of women on the state was nurtured a lot more than the men's as well. There was also an emphasis on motherhood and sort of these token leaders of women. So within the socialist project, because they tried to grow the population, they also would encourage women to have babies, which would then make women have this double burden of coming home and taking care of the children and then also working in the workforce alongside the men. Now, what's the other side of the coin? It looks on paper like the socialist gender order gave a lot of rights to women and made them equal to men. But on the other side of the coin, women were more at the mercy of the state policies than the men were. States intruded on women's reproductive lives. The dismantling of public services had a greater effect on women. So I looked to see, for instance, what has happened in the region, and one of the things that we could look at is, for instance, if you look at reproduction as politics, issues that arose after the fall of communism were issues such as abortion, to legalize or not to legalize abortion, rape as a weapon of war and ethnic cleansing, especially when you look at the Balkans, birth rates, trying to increase the birth rates, the use of contraception, and of course what's going to happen to childcare. Reproduction as politics shows us how state policy and ideological control are experienced in everyday life. Now, why is reproduction important? Human reproduction is the means by which both individuals and collectivities assure their continuity. It's also a ground for political battles. So in essence, for the state, women become vessels of the nation, or an ethnic group. And here the state then tries to control the reproduction of the woman. So yesterday I looked into some of the countries in the Black Sea region and what happened with abortion. In Bulgaria, for instance, abortion was legalized in 1956, restricted in 1968 because the birth rates had come down, and re-legalized again in 1990 after the transition. In Romania, it was legalized in 1957. In 1966, it was criminalized, and then in 1990, it was legalized. Romania had one of the most severe cases of sort of checking women. They would spot check women to make sure that they were not pregnant or that they had not had an abortion in the workplace. Women were subjected to basically routine checks. And of course, motherhood was encouraged by all doctors, and I think doctors had certain quotas of birth rates that they had to have. Russia in 1920, it was legalized. In 1936, Stalin criminalized it because he wanted the birth rates to go up. And in 1953, it was again relaxed. So as you see, these are issues that deal with women's bodies, but they become state policies. And the state begins to intervene in having children, in what's going to happen to women's bodies, and then the state comes in to control whether or not the women are becoming the vessels of the nation that they should. From here, what I'm going to do is now move into my own area that I just wrote a paper in and I'm waiting for publication. I call it the Natasha Syndrome, the effects of failed developmental projects on women in the post-communist states. Now, what I decided to do, living here in Turkey, Turkey is an area where a lot of people are trafficked. And I wanted to know why it was that for the purposes of sex trafficking, a lot of the women that were coming through were coming from a lot of these Black Sea states or post-communist states. So there had to be a reason why the women of these states were very vulnerable, whereas women from other states such as Syria or Egypt were not coming through. And the United States, of course, released a report during this time that actually then told us, made tiered analysis of which countries were falling victim, which countries were actually the sources of sex trafficking. So I engaged in what I call a gendered analysis of globalization. The trafficking of women and girls from this region is associated with globalization, and it's also associated with the transition of post-communist states to a market economy. It also has to do with development, or what I call failed development. Let's give you some numbers for this new form of slavery. They range from $7 billion to $28 billion a year. We don't know what the official numbers are because it's the informal sector and nobody can actually count who's been sort of sold on this market. Women receive none of the money, and the money is taken by organized, or as I came to learn, disorganized crime networks. And these disorganized crime networks within the Black Sea and the post-communist regions were actually bred during the socialist period. In the latter years of socialism, a lot of these organized crime networks were coming up. They were engaging in the black market, they were engaging in many other things, and once the state fell apart, then they moved into other sectors, arms trafficking, the trafficking of women. All of these went hand in hand, and especially if there was a war in the region, they became even more useful. They're disorganized because in many cases they don't have links with one another. They're small networks that just procure certain things and then hand it off to the next network. When we look at the origination of traffic victims in the region, countries that had problematic transition from a communist economy to a market economy is where the women fell victim most. Countries where the state has taken an active role in development in areas such as tourism. So Turkey, for instance, became a major transit hub because we use tourism to develop our economy. In the post-war era, we see origin and destination states such as Philippines and Thailand. In the post-Cold War era, this changed to the Ukraine, Russia, Belarus, and Moldova. Bonded labor exists in certain countries like Pakistan and India, but the proportion of those in the sex trade rises as the countries start to become much more industrialized. Now, in 2006, the UN Office on Drugs and Crime released a report, and here the post-communist countries comprised the largest group where women would fall victim. So let me begin by first telling you a little bit about trafficking and what it is. Trafficking is, of course, a little different in essence from just having somebody brought across the border or illegal migration, because in trafficking the person becomes a slave to the trafficker and can't actually leave the relationship. Now, the effects of the collapse of communism on the sexual exploitation of women has been profound. Now, why is it that the communist state bred the substructure that facilitated the exploitation of women? First of all, there was a corrupt, ineffective state structure that led to organized or disorganized crime in the latter half. By the way, am I speaking too quickly, too fast? Yes, I think, right? I can't hear you guys, but if you shake your heads, I'll probably know. Too fast? Yes, okay, all right. So when we look at the communist state, why is it that the communist state had this substructure that facilitated this exploitation of women? Why is it that these were the countries where the women started to come from? One of the reasons is because the state structures that were corrupt and ineffective during socialism then led to these structures in the post-socialist era. So corrupt, ineffective state structures led to organized, disorganized crime, and when the system failed, these networks then transferred to other activities. So all the black marketeers that were bringing in Levi's 501 jeans into the country then became traffickers for something else. You also had these individuals that were left unemployed. When the men were left unemployed, especially men that were engaging in different sports or different areas, they had to find new things to do. So you find that a lot of the bodyguards or a lot of the organized crime is carried out by men that engaged in martial arts, for instance, or different sports. And they became the people that then became part of the mafia. There is a wonderful work by a scholar by the name of Vadim Volkov on this that he carried out. He did research with organized crime, and a lot of them were also doing arms trafficking, human trafficking, and then sex trafficking. Well, what is communism? When we talk about communism, we have to think of communism as an alternative form of development. That's what I like to think of it as. It's a form of development in which the state makes the decision, so it's not like capitalism. Its development model is different, but it tries to modernize the society and modernize life for its citizens. But in this form of development, something happened where the women fell victim, whereas other areas that had development, like Egypt or Syria, did not have the same problem. I think one of the reasons could be that it had geographic proximity to markets where there was a demand for such services. And then, of course, there are the cultural explanations. My argument in the paper that I wrote is that sex trafficking is the result of failed state developmental projects within an increasingly globalizing world where state efforts to modernize have asymmetric ramifications on women. Women have been exposed to greater freedoms, education, and life standards in these states, only to experience economic crises that have disproportionately affected them. So they became so dependent on the state and less dependent on their families that when the state fell apart, they no longer had the families to depend on, which meant that they had some agency in making certain decisions. Now, this analysis claims that this is the reason why states in absolute poverty or failed states are not as heavily engaged as origin points for the supply of women exploited in sex trafficking. When we look at these states, how do they lure these women? Well, many traffickers at first glance seem quite legitimate. Job advertisements appear in local papers for nannies, waitresses, caretakers, or entertainers in foreign locations, and many of the women are free to apply for these jobs and leave their families if they so choose. In a state like Egypt or Syria, women don't have those rights as much, which means that since women were given some rights in the communist system, they're able to leave their households much more freely. We also see the use of trusted family, friends, and other close friends and significant others who serve as intermediaries. There is a wonderful documentary that won an award 2 years ago. It's called The Price of Sex. If you ever have time, I would actually watch it. They have clippings of it, and they actually have a whole video project associated with it where you can go in and find the profiles of the different women. Moldova is actually featured in it. I believe Romania is featured. The Ukraine is probably featured in it. So they actually have certain countries that have become the origin points for these women. Now, we also see marriage agencies that promise women a better life with a foreign husband, which is another way that women were lured. The return of previously trafficked victims acting the role of trafficker, falsely promoting a lavish lifestyle. And once women were taken out of the country, their travel documents were confiscated. She was imprisoned, and she was forced to work as a prostitute to repay the debts that the traffickers claimed they incurred to bring her into the country. Now, this is the story of what happens in sex trafficking. But then when we look at it from the democratization point of view, then we could say that if women are falling victim, and a lot of women were falling victim to this, especially in the early 1990s, then democratization is incomplete, if you view it in this light. There is a failure of the protection of women. There is a failure to reintegrate victims back into society. There's a failure to prosecute the perpetrators. There's a failure to eradicate the structural causes that have led women to seek these opportunities. And I tie this in with the false equality given to women with the communist project. Full-time labor participation, education, a gender quota that brought them into politics, but regular tasks of women in the household still remained, like child rearing. So when I was, for instance, in the northern part of Kazakhstan, where there was a large Russian population, I was very surprised to find that a lot of women were having babies without necessarily having husbands. And one of the things they were saying is, well, husbands are rare and women do the job anyway, so we will have our babies and take care of them, which is good if you have a job. But when communism fell apart, these women that had the babies and no husbands had no jobs on top of it. And so they needed to find work to support the babies. Now, women became dependent on the state in the communist project, and when the state collapsed, so did the women. Women's jobs were eliminated in the transition. When we look at many of the jobs that were eliminated, public sector, small-scale service, which meant that more than 80% of those who lost their jobs after the collapse of communism were women. More women lost their jobs in the communist collapse than the men. In the Ukraine, that number is as high as 80%. So when you look at the end of the 1990s in the Ukraine, 80% of unemployed were women. 2/3 had post-high school degrees. So you're talking about women that actually had higher education. Women that were doctors, women that were nurses, women that were engineers, women that were teachers. 75% of employed and not working, which meant they were getting benefits like health care, but they weren't getting any pay, were also women. So the collapse of communism then precipitated the entrance into the global economy, which led to the freedom of movement, which led to lure for sex traffickers. So this was a cycle that kept going round and round. And of course, the geographic proximity to rich Western markets was a plus. Unemployment also led men to seek illegal jobs. So if we look at it from that sociological point of view, men were unemployed, and as men are unemployed, then they seek illegal jobs. So the traffickers range from organized to disorganized crime groups, large syndicates to village aunties to corrupt police officers, because the system of the post-communist states was quite corrupt in the early years. I'm not sure it's changed very much. In some countries it has, in some countries it hasn't. Early members of the chain were usually disorganized, and then later they may move up the chain. Now, in one research that was done, there were over 8,000 criminal gangs active in Russia and the newly independent states right after the transition, and many engaged in criminal activities. 2.5% of those were transnational, with operations in 58 countries. So it means that only 2.5% of those 8,000 criminal gangs actually had international ties. So most of them were domestic, being bred out of the communist system. Activities ranged from kidnapping to trafficking to contract killing to racketeering. False documents were needed to get the women out of the country, which led to more contact with other criminal groups, but it also meant that there had to be a corrupt state in order to facilitate these kinds of things. Now, Globalization at this time also had a significant effect because it led to the increase in prostitution and the movement of women across the globe to seek work. Let's look at state development strategies. Investment in tourism. In the last 30 years, less developed countries began projects to restructure their economies. They started to borrow money from the outside. Neoliberalism became popular, taking the state out of the economy. Structural adjustment policies, where government spending and social services were cut significantly. A rise in corruption, and women, of course, being left in more impoverished conditions as a result. Agriculture also began to disappear, and women were left without subsistence farming. So these are the structural changes that have been happening at the global level. So when we talk about development in many countries has not necessarily meant a better life for women. And sex tourism became an easy way to generate capital for some states. I'll give you an example, Thailand. All right, Thailand is one country that used its women to actually increase its economy. Soon, these women, of course, became exports to richer markets. There are other countries that use their women as nannies, the Philippines, Malaysia, Indonesia, so you'd see a lot of nannies from those areas. Very famous political economist by the name of Anna Agathangelou calls this the upper circuits of capital relations, where most studies of globalization occurs, and you don't really get to talk about what happens to the women at the very bottom. A very interesting book in this area that you may want to look at is the work of Cynthia Enloe, Bananas, Beaches, and Bases, which will give you insight on a woman's point of view. When you look at the development of a state, you never look at the role of women. But if you look at Thailand, without the women, Thailand wouldn't have actually been able to develop. So the effects of development on women has been largely ignored. Kevin Bales, who's a leading theorist and somebody who comes from the civil society as well, scholar on, slavery, says modernization has led to erosion of traditional ways of life and subsistence to make way for cash crops and quick profits by corrupt individuals. With the communications revolution and transportation, globalization has increased opportunities for transnational crime. So my paper's argument is that for a region to become a sex industry supplier, it usually will have been in a failed developmental project aimed at elevating the state to another level of modernization. And usually with this experimentation, women will have achieved higher social and labor statuses, which leads to a greater depression when these advances are taken away. The failed developmental project of these states will also have led to a decay in the state with flourishing criminal elements rushing to fill in the void. Now, 1/3 of unemployed women in the Ukraine were recruited into the illegal sex industry. That's one of the numbers that they give. So 1/3 means 33% of the women that were unemployed, and majority of the unemployed were the women. So that then results in a great number. So contrary to popular belief, a study of these post-communist states shows us that sex trafficking doesn't originate in less developed countries. It takes place within the core of the peripheral nations. And if you look at the UN less developed country list and compare it with the Americans' study in this area for origin states, you find that out of the least developed countries, none of them are very high for being origin countries. Only 5 are high, and 17 are low or very low in terms of being origin states. If you look at the Human Development Index or the Gender Development Index rankings of the origin states, only Nigeria and Moldova are low. The rest of the states are where women actually have a lot of power, or women have at least some sort of human development higher than those of the least developed states. And then you, of course, see the need to increase tourism and bring money, which also leads to sex trafficking and lax visa regulations. The example here is Turkey being one of the major transit hubs. Why? Because anyone can get through Turkish borders, as we realized with the ISIS group, right? So getting through Turkish borders is not very difficult, especially with these lax visa arrangements. So I think I'm going to end it at that, I hopefully gave you a window into gender, and how it sort of is very, very much affected and has a lot to do with development, has a lot to do with globalization, and that it is a very real area that you should focus on if you're looking at human security and democratization. So with that, I'm going to leave it and open up to questions. How do I get into questions? Let's see. There is a chat. Where is the chat? Q&A here?
There is a chat, and as that, yeah, if people type up, you will see it.
Now the iPop, where is it?
Or if people type.
Okay. So,
Could be here too.
oh, is that it? Let's try that.
If people type, you can type back, but if they type, you will see it here.
Are these for us? And by the way, if I can get the questions in English, because everything on my screen, by the way, right now is in Russian. And we don't understand Russian, so we don't know what we're looking at. Okay. How come I can't hear people?
Because you are the one who is broadcasting, you're watching.
Oh, I see.
Better that way.
Okay, now I can hear you guys. Okay.
Can you hear us?
I can hear you. Yes, now I can hear you.
We have a question.
Yes. Who's talking? Wait, where?
Yeah, yes. Just a second. It's Odessa National University. And first of all, thank you for your very interesting lecture presentation. And we have a question. Please, I give the floor.
Hold on, let me get a pen.
Just a second, please.
Sure.
Hello.
Hello.
Yana, thank you very much for your introduction to gender sciences. I would like to ask you a question. Maybe you know, of course, that in Ukraine are very popular marriage agencies.
Yes.
Are there any in Turkey, and are they popular among Turkish women? Thank you.
Marriage agency. We have a television show. We have several television shows where women show up to find husbands. So it's instead of the agency, we have the media aspect. But in Turkey, the culture is such that people wouldn't necessarily use marriage agencies. In fact, there are enough village aunties to arrange for marriages for Turkish girls, if that's the case. But more increasingly, we're seeing a lot of these TV shows that are doing it as well. As far as I know, there are no marriage agencies, but Turkish men do use the Ukrainian marriage agencies to find very beautiful Ukrainian wives.
Thank you.
Okay?
Yeah, thank you. Is there any questions?
Any questions?
You can type the whole
Nope. All right. Well, you guys are all international relations students. Am I correct? Yes. Okay. Well, gender is a rising field. It's not a new field in international relations, but it's certainly becoming much more popular. So I hope that did you guys study gender in IR before this, or did you ever have a lesson in gender before? No. It's probably something that you don't even think about, and I didn't think about it a lot either. But then I started to notice that the system is not very fair. So then, you know, once you realize that the system isn't fair, first you become a feminist, you become an activist, and then you carry that over into the scholarly pursuits. So, all right. Any other questions from this other group? I don't know. Where are you guys? The ones that asked the question, you're in the Ukraine. Am I correct? Yanna, I think was your name. You guys are in the Ukraine? Yes, you're in the Ukraine. Okay, and where are you guys, my ladies over here?
The other group is from Bucharest.
Oh, Bucharest. Okay, so you're in Romania. Okay.
It's okay. If my students don't have any question, I'd like to give you one.
Sure.
So,
And your name? I'm sorry.
My name is Octavian Sofran. I'm the assistant of Professor
Okay.
I'd like to ask you if, I don't know, maybe in the national security strategies, there should be formulated such threats against criminal organization, I don't know, something like this. Some states, I know that they have, they formulated very well this kind of threats in their national security strategies. Do you have any information about this?
I do know that when the problem first arose, this didn't exist because it was also something that was very shameful for the women. Many of them wouldn't really talk, and it wasn't seen as important as the other security threats in the region. So if there was a war in the region, nobody cared about the women being trafficked. Recently, because of the work of the United Nations, because of the work of the EU, and then because of the work of many, many civil society organizations, it has gone on the agenda of some of the states. But again, a lot of the women are still ignored. It's very, very difficult to reintegrate the women, for instance, back into society because there's a stigma around it. And so this is something that I don't think any country's done a job that you could actually say has been great at doing, because it's something that is new. It's something that the UN is working on. There are many civil society organizations and there are a lot of funding agencies, but it's just not enough. Hello?
Okay.
I don't know.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Dr. Itir, we have another question.
Yeah.
Can we just a second, please?
My question. You previously mentioned that the problem, that the rise of sex trafficking in Ukraine and other post-communist countries is connected with the globalization and the fall of the state, the fall of leading role of the state in the gender politics. So, what is what solutions can you offer to Ukraine to fight back the corruption, or something, or any other solutions?
Well, fighting corruption is, of course, one of the main issues, first of all, because if the states didn't have the corrupt systems, then the police officers would arrest the people that need to be arrested. Then they wouldn't look the other way. Then there wouldn't be bribes that are coming into the system that are making these women sort of victims. But Hannah had a question, so I'm going to combine it with yours. Hannah was asking if there was a correlation between the number of female legislators. Well, you have to think of it this way. In the communist system, there were a lot of women that were that were parts of the parliament. But that number has dropped for all of the post-communist states once the quota disappeared. Having more women in office does sort of solve it, except it doesn't solve the problem that many of the women that are in office happen to be upper-level women, the elite women, that aren't dealing with the grassroots problems. So one of the things you need to fight off is the corruption. The second thing is the fact that now Ukraine is in a bigger security issue, and most likely your women's issues are going to be sent to the back burner because it's more important, your territorial integrity, all of the things that are happening. So you'll probably not see as much of an emphasis on women as you would have seen some years ago. I think that one of the things that we need to do is realize that women's issues are just as important as any other security issue. And that takes a lot of time. And it does require for gendered education, so it requires for people to know that it's important. It requires for more women to seek office with agendas. So I don't know what else to tell you on what's happening. There's a lot of work that's... Oh, there's also important work done by third-party states that are putting pressure on these countries as well. And so I think the EU remains a very important actor in that regard. And of course the UN. So as long as there are good relations with these actors, then the countries start to fall in line, if not for anything other than foreign aid. Thank you. Thank you for the question. Anything else? Any other questions?
Can you see some chat question? No. On chat. Can you see some question? Because unfortunately I can't see.
No, I don't see any questions there.
Oh, okay. May I also arise a short question, maybe short question.
Yes.
We knew very well that Black Sea states are very different, especially in political culture and so on. What about gender matters? What are gender matters? Gender matters. What are differences between a west part of Black Sea states, Romania, Bulgaria, and maybe some east part as well, Turkey? And what are the main obstacles to overcome with gender inequalities in different countries.
All right. Well, when you look at thank you. When you look at the post-communist states, there are some that are more developed than others, where women's participation in the labor force is higher up. So when you look at, for instance, countries like Romania, Bulgaria, also members of the EU, you're going to find that women are going to have more professional jobs. They're going to participate more in, for instance, state. There'll be more there'll be more civil servants as women, teachers, doctors, pharmacists, dentists. You know, a lot more of these professional jobs. As you start to move to the east or inland, you start to see a drop in women's participation. And that has a lot to do with culture. So, for instance, when you look at countries, as you move towards Kazakhstan, not a member of Black Sea, but as you move towards, for instance, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, those regions, the women are going to be much more conservative and much more in the private space and not necessarily seeking employment outside. Now, what was the second part of the question? I'm sorry. So there is a major difference in development.
Yes,
Yep.
yes.
What's the second part of the question? I'm sorry.
Yes, the main obstacles to overcome this different inequality.
Well, the main obstacles, I think, are there seems to be there's a preconception of a woman's place in many of these cultures. This exists in Turkey as well. So even if the women are working or they're doctors, the private space is always given over to the women. So child caring is always in sort of under the control of the women, or it's the responsibility of the women. Now, when you look at countries like in the Scandinavian countries or other EU countries, you look at legislation that's trying to change the male mindset as well. So one of the major obstacles, I think, in these regions is the fact that even though women are in the workforce and the labor force, the mindset has not changed. That women have a lot more jobs to do. They're still the ones that have to cook, they have to clean. There are certain family honor things that they have to actually adhere to. That has to change. That has started to change in Scandinavia. One way that it's changed, for instance, is with paternal leave in addition to maternal leave. So when a baby is born, the father is also expected to take time off and take care of the baby. 6 months, 8 months, right? Which means that now the dad gets to hold the baby, gets to change the diapers, gets to feed the baby, and the mentality changes. The mentality is much slower to change. Legislation can happen. I'll give you a perfect example of great legislation with absolutely no effect on mindset. The most severe violence against women laws exist in Turkey because of the Istanbul Convention. Except a lot of violence against women happens in Turkey. So why is it that on paper we have these laws, but when it comes to actually reality, none of it exists, and women are being murdered and violated? So you have to change the laws, but then you have to change the mindset, and this is where state power comes into play. Women's issues are not secondary issues. Women's issues are very real issues. Women's issues are issues of citizenship, of human rights, of democratization that are just as important as any other issue. And once states understand that and put it on their agenda, then we can start to make men and women equal in all of these societies. Hannah has another question, I think. Let's see. Let's see. We did that. What is the situation in IR? Why don't we see a lot of female ambassadors from liberal states? Well, because it's very difficult for women to compete in liberal states, number one. You have to be equal. But Hannah's question was, why is it that we don't see more women coming out of liberal states, ambassadors? And one of the reasons why is because you'll find for many, many countries, when the women start to drop off is when they start liberalizing. Because women have to compete with men on equal terms, but they're not equal to the men. So it's the male structure, male-dominated institutions, male-dominated structure, and women has to compete disadvantaged in a structure where the men are advantaged. So this actually puts women behind. This is the reason why you need to have the state sometimes have positive action for women to appoint them. And this is the reason why the mindset has to change. The system has to change. This masculinist system discriminates against women. Any other questions? No? My Romanian girls are smiling, but I get no questions. No? All right. Well, I guess with that, I thank you very much for listening to me. I hope at least you'll look at gender issues a little bit more differently now. And thank you for your patience. Hopefully I'll see you guys in another lecture. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.